How did ancient fanfiction about the magicians of Egypt who competed with Moses end up influencing the New Testament? People love stories, and when a particular story catches the public's imagination, they naturally demand more. So we get sequels. We get fanfiction. People even come up with names and backstories for minor side characters, and that was just as true for ancient Jews and Christians. Did you enjoy the tales of Daniel in the Babylonian court? Here are a few more stories about him and his friends. Are you curious about that mysterious Enoch character in Genesis? Here are several entire books about Enoch and the wondrous things he experienced. I hear you enjoyed reading the Gospel of Jesus. Can I interest you in a few more? And a few more? And, okay, you get the picture. During the early centuries of the current era, there was no fixed biblical canon, and no one was in charge of maintaining continuity and consistency. So sometimes an extra-biblical tale inspired by the Old Testament would find its way back into the Bible, enriching the canonical tradition. An interesting example of that is Jannes and Jambres. These are the names given by Jewish storytellers to the Egyptian magicians of the Exodus story, and they show up in 2 Timothy 3 verse 8 as an analogy to arrogant and self-indulgent people.
As Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these people of corrupt mind and counterfeit faith also oppose the truth. But they will not make much progress because, as in the case of those two men, their folly will become plain to everyone.
The original narrative in Exodus doesn't tell us how many magicians there are or what their names are. So where did this Jewish fanfiction come from, and how did it become Christian canon? It all starts with the ancient Jewish settlement at Qumran that produced the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. One of their foundational documents, known as the Damascus document, describes the efforts of the Jewish devil Belial to lead Israel astray. In one verse, we read the following: "For in earlier times Moses and Aaron arose with the help of the Prince of Lights, while Belial raised up Johanna and his brother in his cunning when Israel was saved the first time." The name Johanna is Jewish, and in context he seems to be an apostate Israelite leader who opposed Moses and Aaron around the time of the Exodus. According to Professor Albert Pietersma, who wrote the definitive book on the subject, this passage is a commentary on inter-Jewish conflict during the 2nd or 1st century BCE. This Johanna, in fact, might be identifiable as a historical individual. You see, the Qumran sect had an enemy known simply as the Wicked Priest in a few of their scrolls. His name is never stated, but the leading academic theory on the Wicked Priest's identity is that he was Jonathan ben Mattathias, the leader of the Maccabees and high priest of Judea from 153 to 143 BCE. The dominant theory about the Qumran sect's origins is that their leader was a Zadokite priest ousted by Jonathan in 152 BCE. Jonathan was later succeeded by his brother Simon, who became the first prince of the Hasmonean dynasty. Jonathan, then, is a good match for the identity of this Johanna, which is somewhat similar in spelling. Now, these associations are tentative, and the exact history of the Qumran sect is a matter of debate. But the point remains that Johanna and his brother are an analogy for false priests opposed to the true Israel represented by Moses and Aaron. However, the legend of Johanna and his brother spread beyond the Qumran community. The brother was given a name, Mamre, and this duo was soon connected to both the Exodus and Balaam narratives. In the most well-attested version of the tradition, they were the sons of Balaam and advisors to the Pharaoh, trained in the Egyptian magical arts. According to one source, Johanna drowned in the Red Sea. Another says that Johanna and his brother joined the Israelites and were responsible for the Golden Calf apostasy. Because these traditions survived only in later Jewish and Christian texts, it's difficult to know exactly when and in what order they developed. Eventually, these traditions were translated into Greek and Latin. In Greek, Johanna became Ioannes. Remember that Greek has no letter H, which was then shortened to Jannes. And Mamre became Jambres due to a scribal corruption. They became famous enough that Pliny the Elder's Natural History, published in Latin in the late 1st century, mentioned Jannes along with Moses as the Jewish founders of a sect of magicians. The 2nd century philosopher Apuleius similarly knew of Moses and Jannes as renowned magicians. At some point between the 1st and 3rd centuries, an entire book about Jannes and Jambres was written and circulated. Origen of Alexandria, a 3rd century church father, describes it as a secret writing and states that the author of 2 Timothy learned about Jannes and Jambres from it. This fact was enough for some of Origen's contemporaries to reject 2 Timothy as scripture. The text of the Apocryphon of Jannes and Jambres survives today in incomplete Latin, Greek, Ethiopic, and Coptic fragments. In this text, Jannes dies sometime after his contest with Moses, and his ghost is later summoned from Hades by his brother via necromancy. Jannes describes the miserable underworld and warns Jambres to mend his ways in order to avoid Jannes' fate. This text might have left its mark in a second New Testament book as well, because according to at least one scholar, the tale of Jannes and Jambres is a possible source for Luke's parable of the rich man and Lazarus. In that story, the rich man, after dying and experiencing Hades, asks to return and warn his brothers of the fate that awaits them. The legend of Jannes and Jambres demonstrates how the texts regarded as immutable scripture today are really just snapshots of religious and cultural traditions that were constantly evolving and expanding throughout the centuries. To summarize, the Jewish Qumran sect invented two opponents of Moses and Aaron who might have been ciphers for the high priest Jonathan and his brother Simon. As the legend developed outside of Qumran, these two men became known as Johanna and Mamre, the magicians of Egypt and sons of Balaam. A book known as the Apocryphon of Jannes and Jambres was produced and distributed in Greek, making the stories about these characters accessible to a wider audience. The author of 2 Timothy was aware either of this book or of similar traditions, and treated Jannes and Jambres as historical individuals who opposed Moses. Just 8 verses after the Jannes and Jambres reference in 2 Timothy is a famous statement often used as a proof text for biblical inerrancy.
Every scripture inspired by God is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that the person of God may be proficient, equipped for every good work.
One must conclude that the Apocryphon of Jannes and Jambres, or a similar apocryphal work, is among the scriptures trusted by the author of 2 Timothy, and is therefore considered to be God-inspired by him. Any doctrine of biblical authority based on this passage must be flexible enough to recognize that not all literature we call scripture can or should be taken literally.
You're playing with the big boys now.
Playing with the big boys now.
Oh, that's pretty. Every spell and gesture
Tells you who's the best.
You're playing with the big